Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to give everyone just a couple more seconds to join before we get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. My name is Marissa Adams, and I am the marketing manager here at Trace. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to drop them in the Q&A section at any time, and we'll answer as many as we can at the end. We will also be sending the slides and recording to all of the attendees and registrants next week. To get us started, I wanted to introduce TraceSecurity and give you some background on our expertise in information security. TraceSecurity LLC is a leading provider of cybersecurity and compliance solutions, and we celebrated 18 years in business this year. Our company was founded on February 18th, 2004, as one of the first technology companies to incubate in the Louisiana Technology Park. Our company's mission at its founding was simple: to help banks and credit unions protect their customer and member information and comply with GLBA, FFIEC, and NCUA requirements. Since then, TraceSecurity has served over 3,000 organizations across the United States, and we have established many partnerships, most notably our strategic alliance with CUNA, the Credit Union National Association, which positions us as their exclusive provider of cybersecurity and compliance services. This partnership also includes endorsement from over 20 credit union links across the US. TraceSecurity offers a comprehensive portfolio of solutions that allow organizations to manage their information security program, including IT risk assessments and audits, social engineering, penetration testing, security training, and more. At this time, I would like to turn things over to my colleague, Mitchell Bearry, one of our information security analysts, who will be discussing risk assessments for financial institutions.
All right, so what exactly is a risk assessment? According to the Oxford Dictionary, it is a systematic process of evaluating the potential risks that may be involved in a projected activity or undertaking. However, when it comes to IT risk assessments, the scope is generally expanded beyond just a single project or service to cover the entirety of the organization's assets and business functions. The purpose of an IT risk assessment is to gain understanding of the assets owned by the company and the risks associated with those assets. This includes both the inherent risk posed by the existence of the assets, as well as the residual risk that applies once controls have been put in place. With a completed IT risk assessment, an organization can then take steps to remove the risk in one of 4 different ways. The first way is by avoiding the risk entirely. An organization can choose to avoid a particular risk by closing, canceling, or otherwise removing entirely the project, business unit, or asset creating the inherent risk. This is the rarest form of risk mitigation, but if the residual risk posed by a particular service is too great, it may be the best option. Proactively, policies can also be established to govern the process for acquiring new assets or starting a new project. Risk assessments can be performed before starting a new project, adding a new business function, or acquiring a new asset to determine the inherent risk and other impact the new system will bring to the company. This will allow organizations to help reduce risk by avoiding it from the very beginning. Alternatively, an organization can choose to simply accept the amount of risk presented by an asset if it is low or not cost-effective for mitigation, and if avoiding or transferring it is not an option. This option may also apply if the risk was incorrectly identified, calculated improperly, or a false positive. However, a company will want to be careful about how this method is used, as accepting a risk that is high or can be mitigated could lead to disastrous results if the threat ever becomes realized. The transfer or sharing of risk is the next possible method and involves removing the liability an institution has for the risk by placing the responsibility on someone else. Cybersecurity insurance is the most obvious example of this step. Another example would be service level agreements or contracts with third parties to shift the risk to their company instead. In this scenario, if a hardware failure occurs, a replacement can be asked for and received from a managed service provider within a short period of time. This lowers the risk posed to the availability of the system by ensuring new hardware is acquired in a timely manner. However, it is important to note with this strategy that it often does not lower the risk of reputation damage an organization may still face as a result of the asset's downtime. Finally, by implementing security controls, an organization can reduce the risk posed by a business function to a level that is acceptable. This is the most common format used to reduce residual risk. There are three typical types of controls that can be used to do this. The first is preventive controls. These controls work to reduce the risk by preventing the vulnerability or source of the threat from being exploited in the first place, as the name implies. A firewall blocking malicious connections over an insecure port is one example of this type of control. The next is detective controls. These controls work after a vulnerability or risk has been exploited and alert appropriate personnel if something is wrong. Examples of these would be SIM solutions or other tools used for monitoring, logging, and alerting of potential incidents. This can also include risk assessments and audits used to identify risks. The final control type is corrective. These controls assume the threat activity has already occurred and work to reduce the risk after the fact. Examples of these types of controls include updating software to patch vulnerabilities, disciplinary action for employees, or updating policies and procedure documents for the future. Risk assessments can be based on many different frameworks. Frameworks were created to provide a standard for evaluation that is independent to the organization. This allows businesses across a variety of industries to evaluate their assets in a similar manner. While some frameworks, such as FFIEC, are focused specifically on financial institutions, there are others, such as NIST or COBIT, that provide a more general set of guidelines that can be applied to many different industries. The components provided by a predefined framework include a shared vocabulary to allow for easy reference and understanding of threats, assets, and controls, consistent assessment methods to ensure the existence of mitigating controls is evaluated in a similar manner each time, thus providing assurance that the verification methods used are accurate, and finally, a reporting system for documenting identified risks and communicating them to appropriate response personnel, executive management, and stakeholders such as a board of directors. This webinar is focused on the FFIEC Risk Assessment template offered by TraceSecurity that is derived from NIST Special Publication 800-30 guidelines. While the reference to NIST may be confusing, it is important to note that the FFIEC standards in general are based on the NIST framework, but tailored specifically towards the financial industry. Additionally, it is important to note that the NIST Risk Management Framework is not the same thing as the NIST Special Publication 800-30, from which TraceSecurity's FFIEC control templates are derived. In practice, our FFIEC risk assessments function more closely to FFIEC audits in terms of the controls being analyzed. The benefit to this approach is that audits conducted with an FFIEC standard can be based on the risk assessment to then tie the two together. The purpose of the FFIEC IT Examination Handbook was to take the security recommendations proposed by the NIST Cybersecurity Framework and customize them to be geared more toward financial institutions while taking into account the requirements of governing bodies for these businesses, such as the FRB, FDIC, NCUA, OCC, and others. The idea was to make the standards for security uniform across the financial industry to ensure compliance is simple and easier to implement through a consistent structure. We've taken the ITEH containing these criteria and combined it with a proprietary algorithm for calculating inherent and residual risk to create a foundation for risk assessments to be performed based on these guidelines that were beforehand intended just for IT audits. Based on feedback from our customers, TraceSecurity also began the inclusion of an asset group containing controls related to the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. This rule requires financial institutions to provide clear explanations to members and customers of their practices regarding their clients' personal information, particularly with how it is shared. These controls evaluate how an organization is treating the sharing of sensitive customer data with third parties not affiliated with the company. The controls will assess whether the organization is doing its due diligence to inform customers of the occurrence of any information sharing and provide them with ample opportunity to opt out of the program. Some of the controls included are shown here. Some other controls will also evaluate whether privacy policies are properly distributed to consumers in a timely manner, if opt-out policy notices are provided, and the methods by which these notices are received. To break down how TraceSecurity's FFIEC risk assessments are performed, let's discuss our tiered system that is used to determine the number of controls. All three tiers assess controls from every asset group, including the more specific ones such as GOBA, mobile devices, VPN, and wireless network. It is important to note that all of TraceSecurity's standard FFIEC risk assessments include all 17 GOBA controls. The difference in the tiers occurs in the number of controls per asset group that are evaluated. Across all asset groups, the Tier 1 contains 123 controls, the Tier 2 183 controls, and finally the Tier 3 255 controls. Each subsequent tier expands upon the baseline controls offered in Tier 1 to provide more specific detail for each asset group and to identify more advanced mitigation measures that can be implemented. For example, it is only upon reaching Tier 3 that the organization asset group, whose focus is the documented policies and procedures of a financial institution, begins asking for details concerning the internal audit program. While there is some room for subjectivity regarding which tier an organization should strive to achieve, most often this will be determined by the institution's asset size. Currently, the categorization is as follows. Tier 1s are for organizations with less than $250 million in assets. Tier 2s are for those between $250 million and $750 million in assets. And Tier 3s are for organizations with an asset size greater than $750 million. Our risk assessments incorporate a variety of factors disseminated across 3 defined groups to evaluate the risk posture of an organization and to determine the security measures that need to be put in place to prevent those risks from coming to fruition. These groups cover 3 areas facing the organization in terms of information security: the assets, the threats, and the controls. First up are the assets, which are separated into distinct groups based on the function or service they provide to the institution. Some examples include data center, VPN, core financial processor, and electronic banking. The threats are spread across different asset groups using a tiered hierarchy system, with only the highest tier threats being specific to the asset group. The lower tiers build upon each other and are commonly found within every asset group. The threats outline the exact risks posed to the organization, such as physical intrusion, privilege creep, or unauthorized access. Included within these threats are calculations on impact to the organization, specific to the values of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Another element used is the likelihood or probability of occurrence. These items combine to form the total residual risk facing the organization. Finally, the controls listed within each asset group represent the security measures that are recommended to be implemented in order to reduce the residual risk posed by the threats. These controls also have similar underlying factors calculated, such as the impact to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability, as well as the probability. However, rather than the impact to the CIA values representing the risk to each of those factors, the impact on the control side is representative of the control's effectiveness at mitigating the impact posed by the risk. Additionally, the probability acts as the likelihood that the control is successful in reducing the risk. While the majority of threats our risk assessments address are related to the technical or policy aspects of an organization, a few cover other areas as well that could potentially impact the information security of an institution. A few examples include physical controls, financial controls, and threats posed by personnel. Next up are a few sample assets, threats, and controls taken into account during our risk assessments. The first asset is the core financial processor, and the threat to it is transaction fraud. This threat covers the possibility for financial risk posed to the organization through unauthorized transactions or account modifications by a bad actor on the core financial application. Seen here is one of the controls used to help mitigate this risk. This control checks for the requirement of dual authorization when it comes to certain high-risk transactions, such as those on dormant accounts, business accounts, or for transactions over a certain dollar amount. For these transactions, it is important to ensure that at least 2 employees are required to authorize the payment. Also, any employees granted the override privileges must not be allowed to override the transactions that they themselves request. Examples of the implementation of this control include supervisor override functionality within the core financial application or daily file maintenance reports that then record the transactions and override history. The former is an example of a preventive control, and the latter is a detective control. Next up, we have the data center. And the threat being evaluated here is environmental disruption. One often doesn't think of physical events when it comes to cybersecurity risk, and if they do, they're even less likely to consider the environmental threats. However, when the majority of servers, network devices, and other critical systems are stored within a single data center or server room, any number of unlikely factors could quickly become a threat. Elevated temperatures and humidity levels, water, fire, and loss of power all affect the availability of the data stored on these systems. Seen here are some of the controls assessed to help reduce the risk posed by environmental factors. Control 4.08 will ensure proper monitoring of temperature and humidity levels with alerts generated to IT or other authorized response personnel when predefined thresholds have been exceeded. Control 4.13 will ensure that servers and other critical devices are equipped with UPS systems or other battery backups to help lower the risk to availability. And finally, Control 4.14 is similar to 4.13, but rather than just ensuring temporary availability via battery backups, it looks for long-term availability via a generator or a contract with a recovery company that will provide the necessary replacement hardware and other resources needed in a timely manner to resume business operations. Finally, let's take a look at the organization as a whole when it comes to unforeseen third-party service provider risk. The threats to be evaluated are not limited to the organization itself. Vendors that provide services to the business can also cause an increase in risk. Instead of attacking the institution itself, a threat actor can choose to target the third party supporting it to indirectly damage the company. One of the most prominent examples of this type of attack is the recent Kaseya attack from last year. Hackers targeted Kaseya, a software company that provides IT software for managed service providers, who then in turn provide IT management and network monitoring services for a variety of businesses. The attackers were able to inject ransomware into a future update to one of Kaseya's software solutions. As a result, any MSP that then utilized the software for their clients, many of whom were banks and credit unions, indirectly introduced malware into the company's network. Seen here are two controls that can be used to help mitigate this risk. As seen in 1.51, a key method for preventing this risk from occurring at your organization is through a strong supply chain management program. Vendor due diligence, especially for your most critical third parties, is extremely important to identify any potential risks before contracting with them. With this example in mind, it is wise for organizations to perform risk assessments of vendors being considered to determine if they utilize any software that may be prone to attack. Specific implementations of this process can also include an evaluation of potential vendors' business continuity plans and their SOC reports to verify if proper security testing and other procedures are being done. As seen in Control 1.52, this can apply not just to new vendors, but for existing vendors as well. Current third parties contracted with the organization should be evaluated on a frequency dependent on their criticality, such as annually for your most critical vendors. TraceSecurity has developed a proprietary formula for calculating risk that incorporates the CIA and probability values. These are used to determine the impact of the threats and the effectiveness of the controls, and then combine them along with additional numerical calculations to produce the residual risk of a threat on a particular asset. To dive deeper into how the actual risk is calculated without going deep into the mathematics of the formula itself, I wanted to provide some screenshots as examples. Here you can see one of the threats used in the assessment, data leak, and how the risk for it is calculated. The first item to note is the threat on the left. As mentioned previously, each of the CIA values present a level of inherent risk to the organization along with the probability of its occurrence, which you can see there in the drop-down boxes. On the right, you will see a list of the controls that apply toward mitigating the risk posed by this threat. The CIA values here show the level of effect the control has upon each of those particular factors, along with the probability of the mitigation being effective. Finally, the graphs will take these values and combine them together to reveal the residual risk this threat presents to the organization. It is important to note that the current graph and the after graph are not representative of the residual risk before and after the controls are applied. Rather, they are merely to demonstrate the risk before and after making changes to either the threat or the control values using the drop-down boxes. These graphs used to be identical. Upon changing the probability of control 10.13 being effective from nominal to strong, as seen in the highlight, the residual risk of the threat's impact to integrity and availability changed from low to very low. Another important attribute to be pointed out is that of risk tolerance, which is the amount of risk your organization can afford to have. By default, all of TraceSecurity's risk assessments assume a risk appetite of low. That is, all threats with residual risk of low or very low are marked as acceptable by default, and those of medium or higher risk are prioritized in the executive summary of the report for remediation. In the screenshot, you can see that even with a strong and moderate effect on the confidentiality risk of the data leak threat, the residual risk merely moved from a high to a medium. This is because this particular threat has not had all controls implemented. There are other controls beyond these two that can serve to reduce the risk, but because they were not implemented, the threat value for confidentiality remains at a medium. If all of the controls were to be implemented, the risk would be reduced to a low or very low, depending on the effect each of the control values is said to have. While not true in all instances, for the most part, if all controls are implemented, even a nominal probability effect by all controls will be enough to reduce the residual risk of the threat to at least a low. Once you have a full view of your residual risk and risk tolerance, your institution will have an understanding of the risks and areas that may require additional investments. The current requirements are for financial institutions to perform annual risk assessments either in-house or through a third-party provider. If you'd like more information about how we perform our risk assessment and review services, you can get in touch with us at info@tracesecurity.com.
All right, we are going to open up for Q&A. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, and I'll go ahead and start with a couple that we already got. Okay, so someone asked if they do their risk assessment in-house, do we have the ability to review that instead of performing our full risk assessment?
Absolutely. So we have another service along with our risk assessment called the risk assessment review, where that is where your risk assessments either performed in-house or through another third-party provider. You can provide those to us and we will be able to review those, do a gap analysis to determine what you're missing in terms of controls versus our risk assessment templates, as well as analyze any other deficiencies or areas in which there may be room for improvement.
Okay, I got one more right now for you. And if their organization falls in the capacity of a tier 2 risk assessment, do they have to purchase that one, or is it kind of up to them?
So I mentioned this briefly a bit earlier in the webinar, but there is room for subjectivity. So of course, asset size is not always going to be the defining factor in terms of what you can do. As a result, there's going to be some small institutions that can do much larger ones that have more advanced security controls in place. There'll be some larger ones that may not be quite up to speed yet and want to do a smaller one to get up to speed and get a baseline identified before they can move forward with the larger ones. But yeah, there's absolutely room for subjectivity and for identifying which one will be best appropriate for your organizations.
All right, I'll give y'all just a second to ask any other questions if you have them. Okay, I got one. What would vendor due diligence do to prevent Kaseya or SolarWinds supply chain attacks?
So vendor due diligence in terms of the Kaseya attack. So this is where it's important, as I mentioned, to identify, with their SOC reports, whether they're doing any sort of penetration testing, if they're doing vulnerability assessments to identify where those holes are. The ransomware attack into the patch update occurred because they had a hole in their patch process that was a vulnerability that was not patched. And as a result, the ransomware was able to be injected. So by doing vulnerability assessments, you can identify that and quickly remediate it in a timely manner. So vendor due diligence, the risk assessments performed there annually for your most critical vendors, especially, as well as on whatever frequency you decide for your other vendors. But yeah, doing that often will help you to identify whether those have been done through the SOC reports, and also analyzing their business continuity plans, their disaster recovery plans, stuff like that can help you identify whether they are ready to respond to an attack such as that, how quickly they will be back up and running, what their recovery time will be, and those items there.
Okay, and what do I do if I have assets that aren't covered in any of the asset groups in your risk assessment templates?
So if there are any of those that you would like to add, we certainly can customize them further. These are just the basic templates that seek to cover the broad range across your whole organization. And even within financial institutions, even as the FFIEC is geared towards those, you can then customize that further to be very specific to how a particular organization operates. So if you have any custom asset groups or controls or even threats that you would like to add, we can fully customize the risk assessment to add any additional threats you're concerned about and in the asset groups you want to have evaluated, as well as customize the controls as needed to make sure that they are properly addressing the security of those assets.
Okay, and the person that asked about the Kaseya supply chain also asked if there's anything specific to SolarWinds.
In terms of anything specific, I can't really speak to that, but that would be another opportunity where evaluating your vendors is definitely important. And even in the aftermath of these attacks, this is where any companies that are still contracted with Kaseya or still contracted with SolarWinds for their Orion product line, or if they are looking to even still get, contracted with them, this is where reputation damage comes in, and that is also extremely important in terms of business continuity. As now, any companies will definitely want to, that are contracting with those companies, will definitely want to evaluate further whether those holes have been patched, what they're doing even beyond what they should be doing to prevent it from happening again in the future, and just really make sure that they are solid on that before moving forward with any plans there. And those two companies certainly serve as a great example to how bad reputation damage can occur, even if you fix the technical issues.
Where are the risks within the tiered risk assessment obtained from?
So those were put together from a collection of our analyst knowledge and their evaluations a while back. We have a few senior analysts that evaluated those and looked at the different security controls in place and what was needed to fix those. And they put together the risk assessments years ago to identify that. And of course, they're still customizable. And they do get updated frequently.
All right, it looks like that is all the questions that we got today, but thank you guys all for joining. And we, like I said, we will be sending out the slides and recording next week. And if you guys have any additional questions, feel free to get in touch at sales@TraceSecurity or info@TraceSecurity, and we'll get you in the right hands for whoever can answer your questions. Thank you guys.